We're going to get started here, so please come on up to the front where there's a handout in one of the chairs. Thank you all for being here this morning. I expect that we'll get, you know how it goes, maybe 10, 20 more people between now and 10:30. Give them a way to get by you and get a seat when they do walk in late. Don't want to make anybody feel bad, but I want to make it easy for them, that kind of thing. I appreciate all of you being here. We have got an important topic to talk about today. We have, I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, who's going to present to us for a number of hours today on some real important stuff. I was introduced to this area of thinking by a guy named Wade Mullen, who wrote a book called Something's Not Right. And he dives into how to understand different kind of abuse scenarios that might be happening in the church. At that point, he introduced me to an organization called Grace, and we've invited Grace. So as a board, over the years, we've been aware of the potential for different kinds, and we've even experienced some ourselves, some abusive situations in our fellowship that have happened. So together, we're trying to equip ourselves, train ourselves up, how to recognize, understand what those situations are, how they might be happening, so that we can take care of the potential victims or victims, how to work with alleged perpetrators, how to respond with ourselves in terms of policy, procedures, law enforcement, those types of things, in order to make our congregation, our membership, a safer place for anybody who walks through our doors. So this morning, I want to introduce to you Mike Sloan, who's from the Grace organization. You can tell us what Grace stands for when you come up here. I forget what Grace stands for. It's an acronym. And Mike has been working with a small group within our congregation that is in the process of developing policy around abuses that might happen within our fellowship, both as a preventive measure and a response plan. Maybe a quick housekeeping tip. We'll break for lunch right around noon. We're going to spend 30 minutes at lunch, come back after lunch. We'll tell you all this again when we're ready to break for lunch. But just so you'll be thinking ahead and hopefully get you out of here maybe a little bit before 3 o'clock. We'll see. But I will give this over to Mike. Mike, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you all for having me. It's really a great privilege to work with churches who have a desire to learn and grow in these areas. So that's just one of the best parts of my job. My background, just so you know, is I served as a local pastor for about 10 years. And overlapping with that time, I started working in this very specific area, helping churches think carefully about abuse prevention and response. And for 16 plus years, I've been training churches in this area, working with leaders on fostering a culture of safety, helping churches develop more effective policies, and with my colleagues at Grace, helping consult with churches when they're facing very specific and difficult circumstances. I even have colleagues, including Wade Mullen, that Andy mentioned, who are on a team at Grace that at times are requested by churches to conduct independent investigations when that's needed. And that's not going to come through some other agency like Child Protective Services, Adult Protective Services, or law enforcement. So, and as an organization, Grace, which is a very clunky acronym, it stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And we're a nonprofit Christian ministry with a very simple mission, and that mission is to educate and empower churches and ministries to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. So in this work of helping churches in very specific cases, even sometimes conducting independent investigations, we have seen how those dynamics in churches often go. And so we're able then with that experience to say, what do we need to prevent this? What do we need in place in churches in terms of training, in terms of policy? And really the simple answer to that question is what's needed is a particular culture. And we know leaders have the most influence in fostering that culture in a church setting. Now, everyone contributes to a church being a place of safety and respect. Every single person present contributes to that on one level or another. And so it's for us as leaders to help foster the heart of Jesus in this area. And we firmly believe that as a Christian organization. Jesus cares deeply about these issues. Jesus spoke strongly against exploitation of others, children, or anyone. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. But the very simple goal of this training is to equip you as leaders to foster a safe culture. That's the simple way to say it. To foster an environment where there is effective prevention. To foster an environment where there is effective response to these issues. So what does that look like? What does that mean? How do we do that? That's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to use a lot of interaction, scenarios to talk about that and think about that together. So that's going to be encouraged at points. If you have questions, we'll have some periods of Q&A where we'll designate for that, and then we'll have scenarios we work through together and talk about together. And then there may be questions you have that you don't want to ask in front of the whole group, and that's totally understandable. If we're on a break and you want to come talk to me, I know I'm very tall, but I promise you I'm not scary. That's why I'm here. I'm here to interact with you, to talk through your questions. So if I can help you think through something, I'm so glad to do that. We're going to have, of course, a lunch break around noon. And then I know it's a church event, but we are going to try to get you out of here on time and with a little bit of your Saturday left. I need to say a few more things before we start. One is, you're going to see a ton of information on these slides that we go through today. And who are my note takers out there? Note takers? I'm a big note taker myself. And I just want all my note takers to take a really deep breath right now, because we're going to give you all of these slides. So, okay. So you're not going to have to say, what was that fourth bullet point on that slide? No, we're going to give it to you because we want you to be able to go back and reflect on these things. When you have a substantive training, what really counts in taking things away from it is the ability to go back and reflect on it and interact around it as individuals, as groups, as teams serving in ministry. So we really want you to be able to do that. I also need to say this. We are going to talk about something very weighty and heavy today. And I just want to say, in a room of any size, there are going to be survivors of abuse, survivors of harassment, or some form of exploitation present. So it's important for me to say that no one is going to be put on the spot today about your personal story, if that is your story. And that's really important because it's important that for any survivor of abuse, that you are able to talk about that only when you feel ready to do that, with someone you trust, when you feel safe, at a time and place of your choosing. So that's a really important leadership lesson for all of us, that it's not okay to put people on the spot to talk about their trauma, to talk about the abuse they've suffered. And so just know that that's not a part of what we're doing today. And if it gets weighty at any point and you need to just take a break, we are going to take breaks because we are human beings. We are not designed by God to sit for hours and hours on end. So we're going to take breaks about on the hour, and then we have our lunch break. And I would just encourage you, though, even if we're not on a break, if you just need to move around and stretch and stand in the back, or that's totally fine with me. It's not going to bother me one bit. If you just are feeling something that feels so heavy in that moment, and you feel like you even need to step out and get some air or something, we are recording this. You can always come back to it. it's okay. So just want to make sure you have that empowerment to make that choice to care for yourself as you need to. And other strategies that you might use that could be helpful, I've learned some over the years doing this work because I have to, because it's heavy work. So just taking a sip of water, swishing it around your mouth. Water is allowed in this space, I'm told. So taking a swish of water, swishing it around your mouth and swallowing. A trauma therapist taught me that's like turning your phone off and on again. Just kind of resets the brain, the body with that physical sensation. Doing some deep breathing. Breathing in for a slow count of 4. Holding it for a slow count of 4. Breathing out for a slow count of 4. So I'm going to try to check in with you on self-care and remind you of that as we go throughout this. That said, there's nothing intentionally graphic or shocking that we've put into this training. We are going to have straightforward scenarios and conversations about certain things. But in our view, that's not helpful to be intentionally or overtly graphic in certain things. So now, just so you know a little bit of where we're going in this training, we are going to talk about this idea of the role of leaders and the role we have, especially in fostering a culture that reflects the heart of Jesus. We're going to get some common ground with some basic definitions and talk about some common dynamics, just so we can get all on the same page with some of those things. And we're going to talk about a very important question. How does prevention work? Because that's what, as leaders, I imagine we're all after that, right? We don't want to be having to deal with response situations. We'd prefer that we don't have to do that. Now, we are going to talk about, if we have to, what does that look like to do that well and responsibly? But overwhelmingly, my guess is we want to be on the prevention side as much as possible. So we're going to talk about how that works and what that can look like. And then we're going to give you, at the end of that introductory part of the training, a 4-part framework that we've developed in our experience that we think are the 4 critical areas for leaders to foster that type of culture that I've been talking about. And then we're going to use that 4-part framework that we're going to give to you today, and we hope you take it with you and take it forward. Because again, it's something you steward, it's something you foster, it's something you tend to and cultivate as leaders. And we're just going to walk through those 4 areas together and talk about those 4 critical areas together. And that's the training. So this introductory part, and then we're going to walk through that 4-part framework. That's what we're going to be doing. So let's just start with this basic idea. Again, that this is a calling from God, that God cares deeply about safety. Jesus talked about this actually very directly. Jesus warned in that famous verse about the wolf in sheep's clothing. Think about that verse for a second. What was Jesus talking about? He was talking about someone who was a part of the faith community, not a stranger, but a person who was a part of the faith community. And think about what he was describing. Is he talking about someone who walks in the front door of the church and says, "I'm a wolf, bring me your children"? No, of course not. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about in the context of false teacher, false prophet, depending on your translation, right? Someone who has a leadership role, someone who has power and trust in the community, and is there in a way that no one thinks they would ever hurt one of God's precious lambs, right? And that's the point of the metaphor, right? Wolf and sheep, wolves act in an exploitative way, a predatory way towards the more vulnerable sheep. So Jesus is talking about someone who is intentionally there to serve themselves and do what they want and take what they want and use others in a very transactional way. Now that exploitation could be financial, it could be sexual, it could be different ways we're human. But the point is, it's a very intentional hiding who they truly are, and manipulating the community to think of themselves as a person who would never do that. Does that make sense to you? That's what Jesus is talking about. That's what he's warning about. This is exactly what experts on abuse teach us today. Dr. Anna Salter is a leading expert in this field. She went to prison after prison to talk to offenders. And one of her main takeaways from her research is that offenders are intentional. They're looking for environments where they can manipulate people and get away with it and they won't be held accountable. So to go back to Jesus, though, Jesus taught us something really incredible and so foundational when he was talking about this same reality, again, of exploitation, because that's, again, how wolves act toward the vulnerable sheep. He said, as Christians, we are to be the opposite of the wolf. So in the animal kingdom, what's the opposite? He says, you're to be like a dove. The dove is harmless. The dove would never exploit or hurt anybody. You be like a dove. And, do you hear that? And what? And be wise like a serpent. Be wise. Understand how things work. And this is especially important for us as leaders, that we are not naive, that we understand these issues, and that we work against them. So that's what Jesus is calling us to. Are you with me? Dr. Salter said the same thing. This makes me feel good as a Christian. When I read things in leading experts that I can say, yep, Jesus talked about that. That's amazing. She said, it's precisely our lack of knowledge that gives people who prey upon others, people who exploit others, their edge. If we don't understand it, if we're not wise like a serpent, we can't do much about it. And so we have to really think carefully about that. There's another amazing researcher. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Fried. And she has this amazing language about institutional courage that I love to put in front of leaders. She says what we are called to as leaders, and I think this resonates incredibly well with our Christian faith. She says we are, as an institution, called, and of course leaders, we bear the most responsibility for the environment, for the institution. She says we are called to show institutional courage. And what that means is that we are to seek the truth and engage in moral action, despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term cost. Does that resonate with Christian faith? I think it resonates incredibly well. In fact, we talk a lot about truth. We talk a lot about right and wrong, moral action. We talk a lot about counting the cost and doing the hard thing that's needed to be done. In fact, that's all those things Jesus talked about and leads us in. So faith communities, of course, we all know from news stories and scandals that get reported on, there are times where churches fail to do the right thing. Institutions often fail. And yet, we, in our work at Grace, we work with tons of churches who are committed to learning, committed to growing, committed to doing the right thing. So I am incredibly hopeful. And so again, I just want to thank you for having me. And I trust that this is going to be a really helpful conversation for us to have together. Let's just build a little bit of foundation and common language before we go any further. How do we define abuse? Now, I've put some definitions on your handout. If you didn't get a handout, maybe your neighbor can look around and make sure you have one. And maybe we can even share if we need to. So in general, a good general definition of abuse is when a person holding power and trust, and that's almost always the case when it's any form of abuse. It's almost always someone known and trusted when you look at any form of abuse. There are exceptions. There are strangers who assault people and do terrible things, but mostly, statistically even, it's almost always someone known and trusted. And that's whether it's a child, whether it's an adult who's a victim, it doesn't matter. But it's someone holding power and trust, using that power and trust, that relationship, that access, to exploit, to violate, to dominate in some way. And of course, that can be any way that we're human. It can be financial, it can be sexual, it can be physical, it can be emotional or spiritual. So that's at the core of understanding what abuse is, that it's almost always someone known and trusted, and that it's using power and trust in that relationship intentionally to weaponize that, to exploit someone in some way. Now, just some basic statistics for a couple of main areas of abuse in our country. There is a landmark study called the ACE study. I'm sure a few of you here at least have heard of ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there are studies, not just the ACE study, but many that bring back these basic numbers, that it's about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men suffer sexual abuse before age 18. And you can see a basic definition of a sexual abuse of a minor there in your handout. It's about, similar 1 in 4 for physical abuse. Now, this is not spanking without injuries. That's not considered physically abusive under the law. But when there are injuries or a really pattern of continually frightening a child, that's considered physically abusive. Emotional abuse is a little bit more difficult to define. We're going to define it and spend a little bit of time on that here in a moment, as well as spiritual abuse. Emotional neglect is the other side of the coin when a child is not told positively they are loved, they're cared for. Emotional abuse, we'll get to a definition of that in a moment. Physical neglect is not about poverty. That's a separate issue when there are a lack of resources. But when there are resources in a home or in a school environment or something, and those are intentionally withheld out of cruelty, food and clothing and things like that, medical care, that's considered physical neglect. So a few basic definitions there. And then intimate partner violence, when there's violence in a marriage, in a dating relationship, something like that. The American Medical Association believes it's about 1 in 3 women across a lifetime will have some experience of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Men are also victims at times, but the vast majority of victims are women, okay? And then adult clergy sexual abuse, when pastors who hold a position of power and trust, when they cross sexual boundaries with adults under their spiritual authority and care, more and more we're able to recognize this as an abuse of power, not just as a sin issue or an affair or adultery or things like those categories we might use, which might be correct in some sense. But it's important to define it as an abuse of power. And about 15 states now in the US have some form of criminalizing in their laws that say when pastors cross sexual boundaries with adults, that's actually now criminalized. Just like counselors and doctors and therapists are not permitted to cross those professional boundaries with their patients or the people they're treating, right? So it makes sense. So adult clergy sexual abuse occurs when a pastor is crossing those spiritual boundaries. Now, Jesus talked about abuse very directly, as we've already seen, but let me just share one more passage with you, and I want us to kind of start talking about what's happening in this passage. So here's our first chance for some interaction. So in Mark 12, Jesus was teaching, and he said, "Beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers, they will receive the greater condemnation. So here's my question to you. Let's use our modern categories, and let's say, what kind of abuse could we call this? And here's a little hint. There's more than one right answer here. So let's unpack this a little bit and talk about what Jesus is describing and what he's calling our attention to. What type of abuse could we call this? Any ideas? Yeah. Is it financial? Yeah, it has to do with property and physical possessions, and there is a theft of those, so it is financial. Absolutely, this is financial exploitation, financial abuse. Of course, very good. What else? Yeah. Emotional. How could we see this as emotional? Any ideas? Yeah.
They're being manipulated and groomed, which I know you'll get to grooming, but to think of this stuff as normal, where they have to give this money, they have to do this stuff, and it's not normal.
And who is doing this? It's on some level, it's someone who is a spiritual leader in their community, who leads the community in prayer. We don't have an exact equivalent of what exactly this category would have been for that community at that time, but it's clear it was a spiritual leader on some level. And it's emotional and spiritual because these are relationships of people they know and trust, and there is manipulation, there is deception, and using of that relationship and the emotional connection and the spiritual connection of trust that's being weaponized. How do they even get close to these widows who are vulnerable? It's through that relationship. And that's how it happens. So yes, emotional and spiritual. How about clergy? These are formal spiritual leaders on some level. We could call this some form of clergy abuse of power. Absolutely. And I would say probably elder abuse would be another category. Not all widows are elderly, but just like in our day, many widows are elderly. And no doubt some of these widows were. And they're more vulnerable and they're being preyed upon. So did Jesus talk about abuse ever? Yeah, actually quite a bit. And here's a passage where, is he indifferent toward it? Does he have opinions? He has opinions, and he says, this is unacceptable, and those who do this deserve very severe judgment. This is not okay. Can you think of other passages where Jesus condemned exploiting others, like children? You remember the passage about the millstone as an image of severe judgment for those who would exploit children? Absolutely. Jesus directly condemned the exploitation of children, the exploitation of widows and the elderly, financially, sexually, otherwise. Yeah, this is very clear. Now, here's another foundational issue to understand abuse and how we respond to it. In the church, we say things like, we are all sinners. Amen? Amen. We are all sinners. Absolutely. And yet, abuse is not two people sinning. That's not what it is. Abuse is one person sinning and one person being sinned against. If we don't get that crystal clear, we are going to do damage as we respond. Because even if we're putting less responsibility on the victim, we're still putting some responsibility on the victim. And that is never okay. So abuse is not two people sinning. It is one person sinning and one person being sinned against. As leaders, we have to get that deep in our soul. And more importantly, we have to help our people in our church get that. And that's a real important leadership responsibility. Now, here is just a slide with common abuse dynamics. Abuse involves power, and many of these we've already mentioned, right? We talked about the wolf in sheep's clothing and so forth. So here's just a summary of common abuse dynamics. Again, these are things we need to grasp as leaders and help our people understand. So abuse typically involves someone holding power on some level Now, is it always formal power of like a title? No, not always. And some dynamic of vulnerability that's being exploited. It involves some level of trust, almost always, that's being weaponized. And it's not just trust between, like, say, a youth leader and their student, although, yes, if they're trying to target the student who's a minor for exploitation, yes, there is deception and using weaponized trust, but it's also the student's parents. It's also others in the community. It's not just the individual who's being targeted. When adults exploit others, there are often deep-seated attitudes of entitlement in that person. And by that word, by entitlement, I mean attitudes like, I can do what I want. I can take what I want. And no one's gonna hold me accountable. It's a very transactional way of thinking about other human beings. Is that how Jesus told us to think about other people and treat other people? No, he said the opposite. He said, you are to love your neighbor as yourself, meaning you are to put yourself in the shoes of any other person and think, how would I want to be treated? And it's a call to deep empathy, right? To consider how they're being treated and what that impact must be. So, and attitudes of entitlement, it's a very dehumanizing way to treat other people, to objectify other people, to use them for their finances, to use them for sexuality. Deception and manipulation, that's the wolf in sheep's clothing part we've talked about. And many offenders will try to isolate and render powerless the person they're exploiting. And isolation is not just physical isolation, like taking them to a more isolated place physically, although that can be part of it, but it's also isolating them relationally, emotionally, spiritually at times, to depend upon that perpetrator, to kind of cut them off from others who could intervene or help them. And often that's using tactics to keep them silent, tactics like threats and fear, using shame and guilt and spirituality to kind of control and silence. Now there is a scenario here, and it's a terrible scenario. And I'm just gonna leave that here for you to read. It's about a youth leader who exploits a person in their youth group. But you can read that on your own time if you want to. If it's too intense, that's fine. But you will see all of those dynamics in this scenario. But what I would rather do is talk positively about prevention. And so let's go to scenario 2, and let's talk about how prevention actually works, okay? Now, and here's where I'm gonna get more interaction from you. So I'm gonna read this scenario about a student pastor, Tony, and if you're in student ministry, God bless you, and I'm not trying to pick on you. It's just a way to talk about prevention in a concrete area of ministry. We can apply this, though, in every area of ministry is what we want to do. But let's look at scenario 2. This is on page 2 of your handout at the bottom there. And let's talk about how prevention works in this scenario that's very concrete. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask you this very specific question, and it's there in your handout. What could leaders do ahead of this scenario to actually positively impact prevention, the prevention we all want to see? Okay? So here's the situation. Erica is 13 years old. She's grown up in the church. She loves her church and her pastors. Tony, her student pastor, is taking seminary classes. He is funny and charismatic. He is a great Bible teacher. The kids love him, and the parents love him because they see the kids wanting to go to church. Amen? Amen. And Tony's colleagues also love and appreciate that he's helping draw more families to the church. On a particular Wednesday night, when student ministry is winding down, only a few people are left waiting around the foyer of the church. Erica's mom is running late to pick her up. Tony says to Erica, hey, I've got something for you I forgot earlier. Come with me to my office for a second. What do most church kids do when the pastor asks them to do something? They do it. I grew up in church. Like, that's how it usually works for most church kids. Tony and Erica start walking away from everyone else toward a back hallway in Tony's office. This area of the church is very isolated at this time of the evening. As Tony and Erica turn the corner, though, they pass a young mom in the church who ran back in to grab her son's coloring paper that he left in a classroom. Now, given this scenario, if Tony did have bad intentions toward Erica, what could leaders have done ahead of time to impact prevention? There are obviously lots of good answers here, but what are the things that come first to your mind? Let's start talking about it. Yeah.
We always have the policy of having two adults. We always have the policy here of having two adults in the room when any teens are.
That's great. Having two adults when you have students, when you have kids, absolutely. That's an amazing policy. And that's a way to bring accountability. So there were some adults in the foyer, but what did they not do, apparently? They didn't say, hey, wait. But putting that on policy is absolutely really critical. Policies alone don't protect kids, though. So what do we need to do beyond that? What are some other thoughts you have? Yeah. Amazing. So I'm going to repeat it for the recording. So you teach everyone in the church, what is the standard? What is the expectation? The expectation is you don't take an individual kid, not your own kid, to an isolated place. We just don't do that. And in this case, like you said, it could have been the people in the foyer. It could have been this young mom. In most churches, I will just tell you, because we review policies for tons of churches every single year and have done for years, most church policies, if they have training, who do they train? The staff of the church and the volunteers who work specifically with the students. Do they train the church as a whole? Like this young mom, if she doesn't work with the students or the kids, she probably doesn't have any training. She probably is not even aware of what the policy says, and that it says, don't take a teenager to an isolated place. So that's a gap that many churches have that, again, when we're thinking about culture and Jesus's heart and prevention, we can't just simply have a narrow view of, as long as we do the insurance company thing, minimal things, like have people have a training who work directly with students. And I'm not against that, by the way, that's a good thing. But that's just not, we need to think a little bit more holistically, right? Okay, what else? What other thoughts? Yes, ma'am. Oh.
Probably just, was there a background check on these
Yes.
adults that are supposed to be with these kids? And by the way, what is the policy?
That's right. Is there screening measures that are effective? Are those standardized? If Pastor Tony was fired from his previous job, he's probably not, if he's serving now, he's probably not been convicted of anything. But if they had called the previous church when he listed out his work history and said, well, why did he leave there? And if he left there for a concerning reason, again, some churches, that's a gap. And yes, sometimes we're missing some of those steps that absolutely must be done. Okay, what else? Yes.
Not only making sure that the adults are aware, but that the youth are aware.
Absolutely. Now, we don't put the burden on the students to protect themselves, but we absolutely talk about how they should be treated with respect and what safe boundaries are. We give them empowerment to speak up if there's a problem. And bad faith actors don't want us to be doing that. And the same with elementary age kids. And we're going to talk more about how you do that today, because that is an important way to raise safety, is by talking about it, even with the teens and the elementary age kids ourselves. Absolutely. Other thoughts? Maybe just one other. Yes.
Actionable consequences and also record keeping for any incidences that may occur innocent.
Yeah, if someone is, let's say this is the third time Pastor Tony's done this. Let's say the first 2 times someone has intervened and said, remember, Pastor Tony. But in many churches, what does not happen is what you just said, is they don't actually document. And so if you see something concerning one Sunday in the hall after church, even if you intervene and say, hey, let's remember not to force that hug on that kid who clearly doesn't want that hug, or let's remember not to take that teen to an isolated. If it's one person and they've done it, even if you intervene in each individual situation, if you do that well, wonderful. But if you don't tell leaders so it can be properly documented, you're missing the pattern. And a proportional response to someone who keeps pushing boundaries is if they keep showing you who they are, what did Maya Angelou say? You believe them. You believe them. And you have to take more appropriate action, right? So absolutely. So just think about the things we've mentioned, which are all really important things. Policies, screening, boundaries. But who knows the policy? We want really the whole community to have a few basic understanding of the most important aspects of a policy, not every detail. You're not going to get people to read your policy in your church, of course, but you can tell them a few key things, and everyone should know, hey, no one should be taking a minor to an isolated place. No one should be forcing physical touch or affection on people that don't want it. That shouldn't be happening. No one should be sharing sexual stories and content with the students or the kids, right? Things like that. Big, bright line boundaries. Then, training. Again, we have to think about the gaps in training and empowerment to speak up. So does the mom in the hallway know, hey, even though that's a pastor, if I'm the only one seeing it, I have a responsibility. If I can't intervene and do bystander intervention, I can go get another leader, and that matters. And that we have those mechanisms for documenting so we can see if there is any kind of pattern of pushing boundaries. And often that's how you actually often can see grooming for what it is. Because someone who's intent on doing that is going to keep trying. Almost certainly. Now, all of those things I mentioned, I don't think that's controversial. I don't think it's rocket science either. But those things don't happen without leadership. Does that make sense to you? And to thinking, who is getting training? And of course, you can't overwhelm people, and you can't have the whole church read your whole policy. Again, we have to think really realistically and strategically about what we do. So we're going to come back to that as well. So, yeah, you have a question, please.
I know, I understand in the context of being at church, don't go anywhere alone, but I was just thinking about, like, what about scenarios where a different family will invite another child to their home to spend the night?
Sure.
What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so families are going to make their own decisions about certain things. You can't raise kids without any help. I have 5 kids. I know this from personal experience. But we do need to think carefully. And I think the skills we would want everyone to have to contribute to safety here will also help families make those decisions and make really good decisions in their own homes and how they set up certain situations. And I'm never going to tell a family exactly how to do that, and every church even. You're going to have to decide that for yourselves as a church family, and then as individual families, how you do certain things. But the skills we all want everyone to cultivate and learn, we can apply, and that really matters. Yeah. So do you see, yes, one more question. Yeah.
1 minute.
The question is about security cameras. You're doing great, by the way, with the microphone. Let's give her a round of applause. Okay. What really counts in certain things for prevention is understanding what something can do, but also what it can't. And it's the same with background checks, by the way. Background checks can catch people who have been convicted, but most people aren't convicted who represent a danger to others. So we do them, but we don't put all of our eggs in that basket, so to speak. The same with cameras. Cameras can be helpful if we need to go back and check what happened, if it is covered by sometimes it can be helpful. But notice what I've said, even in that brief description, we're not really talking about prevention at that point. We're mainly talking about how do we stop something from continuing after it's already happened. So again, we have to be just really realistic about that and not put all of our prevention into that, because cameras don't typically stop or do a ton in terms of prevention itself. And offenders will offend with cameras. We know of cases where this has happened. They just use their body to block what's happening, or they use the camera as plausible deniability to say, well, what do you mean something happened? There are cameras, that kind of thing. So yeah, good question. All right, let's keep going, and then we'll have time for more Q&A. Now, a couple of other things to say as we're laying a foundation is it's important to understand that abuse is typically a pattern of behaviors. So I mentioned grooming as a tactic, which is like a systemic testing of boundaries. That's one way to think of it. But even abuse itself, like domestic violence. So there's a wonderful organization they have a website, the Duluth Model, you can look it up. And they have a very helpful, what they call the wheel of power and control. So in a coercive relationship like a marriage, you have a variety of coercive behaviors that can be physical and sexual, but also emotional, financial, relational, and so forth. So this is really helpful in understanding that abuse is a pattern. They have one for child abuse, which is in a home, that's often a pattern as well of behaviors. And then when there is grooming by someone who is a coach, a teacher, a pastor, where there is again, a grooming pattern, it's again often a pattern of behaviors where there's spiritual, emotional control, even though the goal of the exploitation is clearly sexual. Now, they also have wonderful positive framings of healthy relationships, the wheel of equality, and what that can look like in a relationship. They even have a Christian partnership wheel of healthy Christian relationships, and how, scriptures can be twisted to manipulate, to control, but how it should be used positively also. So highly recommend these wheels from the Duluth Model. Now, I want to talk about emotional and spiritual abuse and do a little bit more work on that. So we already mentioned this passage, right, in the teaching of Jesus, where Jesus talked about emotional and spiritual abuse of power. So look on page 3 on your handout. And look at those definitions there. So emotional abuse, one way to define it, is this pattern of behaviors where a person using power and trust, they're using it to domineer and control others. And it can be acts like shaming, dismissing, bullying, threatening, intimidating, humiliating, degrading, insulting. So it can look a lot of different ways, right? And often it's a pattern of different types of those coercive controlling tactics. It's difficult often because usually you don't see the whole pattern, so it can be harder to recognize by any one person especially. And then spiritual abuse is it's essentially emotional abuse with a spiritual component. So using God, using the Bible, using faith, using scripture in that pattern of domineering, in that pattern of controlling. And often, spiritual abuse goes side by side with other forms of abuse, not just as a form of emotional abuse. So in the example of Jesus that we saw, the spiritual abuse of those spiritual leaders was side by side with financial exploitation, right? So there was a goal of exploitation, in this case financial, that was being pursued by these patterns of domineering, coercive behaviors that were emotional and spiritual. And I've given you on page 3 into page 4 some examples in a church setting of emotional, and then in the bolded portion, spiritual abuse. Now we're going to do an interactive exercise. Because abuse is a pattern, but of course it also happens on a spectrum of behavior, more severe to less severe, and we can even think of all human behavior. Okay, I need to make sure. Okay, so healthy is going to be over here to match the slide. So we can think of healthy behaviors, unhelpful behaviors on the spectrum, unhealthy, and then at the most severe end of the spectrum, abusive. So now I'm going to read some brief descriptions, and here's what we're going to do together. If you are willing to just call out, where do you think this situation falls, given that four part spectrum? All right, so this is on page 4 at the bottom. So here's the situation. A young person, so this is at church, a young person at church makes an announcement about an opportunity to serve in a local ministry. They end the announcement by saying, "It would be great if you all could come. I don't know when it starts or what you need to bring, but please come." Okay, just call it out. Where would you put that? Unhelpful. Okay, I agree. It's healthy in that this seems to be a young person who has a heart for ministry in the Lord. Wonderful. But it's unhelpful because have you ever been to a church ministry opportunity where if you didn't have work gloves, you were in trouble, right? If we were cleaning something up and you need work gloves, yeah, if you need those work gloves, you need them. So if we don't know when it starts or what to bring or how to dress, if we're doing work or helping in what way, that's a problem. Now, does this student need a strong rebuke? Do we need to follow our abuse policy protocol? Of course not. We just need a little gentle what? Like, can you tell us when it starts? Excuse me? Or can you find out and let us know? And, something like that, right? Just a little gentle nudge, right? We don't want to discourage them. We don't want to provoke them to wrath, right? As Paul says about the young people. Now, number 2, a leader explains an urgent need for a local ministry that the church supports. She explains the need and how the church members can participate. Come at 11, bring work gloves. The leader ends by saying, "This is a wonderful ministry that needs help. If you are able to make this, it would be a great way to show love for our neighbors." Where would you put this? Healthy. Seems really healthy. Now, if she was like guilting us and manipulating us with guilt, we would say, okay, can we all imagine what that could look like? Well, the real Christians, right, are going to be the ones that show up to this ministry event. And if you're not a real, true, faithful Christian, if we're getting guilt and things like that to manipulate, to coerce, that's at a minimum, that's unhealthy, right? Okay, very good. Y'all are doing great, by the way. Number 3, An exasperated staff person explains to the church one Sunday in an announcement, "We have a need for 2 more volunteers for this event on Tuesday. Some of you need to listen to this because you come to church and take and don't give." And in an exasperated tone, they say, "I mean, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out. But if you don't mind considering whether you can help us, that would be great." Where would you put this? Yeah, it seems unhealthy. That's, I think, what most of you said. Yeah, I agree. Now, I have sympathy in that I recruited volunteers to serve in ministry, to serve with a Sunday school program and volunteer with and supervise the student. I recruited people for years. I can understand that this can be hard. And as a leader, do we want to have some intervention for this type of behavior? Yeah. But here's the thing. Do we want to intervene so we can do what? Move it back down the continuum, right? Toward the healthy. To say, maybe let's think about how to say this in a way that's more constructive. But also as a leader, we could say, while addressing that, hey, this is not a good way to speak to people, can we help you and support you also? And can we talk about what's going on here? So I think some gentle intervention in that would be really, really important. But can you see that this continuum is helpful? Because we want to intervene early so it doesn't continue down the continuum, right? Down the spectrum. We want to move it back toward the other way. Okay, number 4. In a church meeting, a member raises a concern about a ministry with which the church is partnering. The pastor cuts him off and says, "You don't need to know about that because that is above your pay grade." The pastor takes a belligerent posture toward the member and says in a raised voice, "My vision for this church includes this ministry. This train has already left the station. If you don't like it, jump." This type of outburst is common from the pastor. Many members and staff have left because of it. Where would you put this on the spectrum? Yeah, now let's think about why for a minute, because I agree with you. It's a pattern. It's deeply impacting people. It's extreme behavior. It's all or nothing. And it's threatening, really belligerent behavior. And it's a pattern. It's extreme behavior. It's a pattern. It's really deeply impacting people. And that's, when we say emotional and spiritual abuse are patterns of behavior, that's how they're best defined. You can take a singular behavior, an incident, and say that is verbally abusive. Of course we can. But typically, when we're defining something, we're recognizing it in a pattern by recognizing it in those ways. Is it on the extreme end of the behavior? Yeah. Is it really impacting people such that people are saying, "I didn't sign up for this"? It's also just very extreme behavior, threatening, belligerent, all or nothing. And when those are patterns, those are the telltale signs. All right, number 5, a leader makes a snarky remark. Now, okay, let me stop for a second. Can you imagine, though, a member of a church who has been told 6 times, here is why we partner with this ministry, and here are the reasons, and I am not going to talk about it a 7th time right now, please. And the pastor responds gently but firmly, but isn't belligerent, isn't insulting, but just says, as a boundary, I'm not going to talk about this again. I can't right now. And the leadership has made this decision, and we're going to move forward. Do you see? That's a very different. And you can have a member who is, who they then become, you can have it up at the leadership from a member. You can have it from leaders down. It can be side to side is one way to conceive of that. A leader makes a snarky remark, number 5. in a meeting to another leader in an intense ministry discussion, this is uncharacteristic for the leader to make this snarky remark. The leader initiates a conversation with the other leader and apologizes without excuse. The leader doesn't repeat this behavior again. Where would you put it? Okay, it's healthy in how the leader responded. You know, getting frustrated and saying something you shouldn't, that's not good, but I wouldn't call that abusive. Why? Is it a pattern? No. Is it really extreme behavior? No. I mean, it's not good, but it's not something we'd call extreme. It's not threatening even, or anything like that. And the leader, importantly, was self-aware. I fell short, that wasn't good, and I'm gonna go make it right. And not give a non-apology, but a real, genuine apology, seemingly, right? So I think that's a way to, again, you see the nuances of some of these categories. There's a really helpful book, and it's referenced at the bottom of page 4 in a footnote. Lisa Oakley co-wrote a book called Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse. So she's a researcher in the UK. She has served on Grace's board, and just as a real expert in researching emotional and spiritual abuse, highly recommend that book. And this exercise is inspired by her and her categories. So again, I hope that framework is helpful for you as leaders to be able to intervene with people and help move them back toward the healthy end of the spectrum. So when there is healthy behaviors, you don't need to intervene. You can just affirm, well done, that was great. When it's unhelpful, like the student, you can give a little nudge, but very gently, right? And it's not even a rebuke or correction, just as more, formation. And then when there is unhealthy behaviors, again, that's when we do need to intervene as leaders. And yet, we're not dealing with abuse, but we're trying to move that behavior constructively with support back down the spectrum. But when there is a leader acting like the leader in example number 4, that's when other leaders must step in. There must be, significant intervention for those types of behaviors and accountability. Please. And while she's getting there, and just give me 1 second, power, abuse, power on its own is not a problem. Power, all of us have power in some form or fashion. The key is, how are we using it? And are we using it in ways that are Christ-like, ways that are legitimate? So using power legitimately, setting boundaries when that's appropriate, seeking accountability, calling people to walk in the ways of Jesus and in the ways of our faith and our faith tradition, that's all legitimate. You can do those things, though, in ways that are toxic, manipulative, coercive, that is not healthy. You can have, though, conflicts and disagreements that are not involving abusive behaviors. You can disagree as humans, and that doesn't necessarily mean there is abuse happening. However, can you imagine within conflicts and disagreements, there can be people deploying patterns of behaviors that we would call emotionally, spiritually abusive or otherwise? Yes. And then there are behaviors that are harmful or unhelpful that absolutely would fall short of. So with my kids, sometimes they're using words like trauma to describe being given homework. And I have to say, as a parent, no, that's not trauma, sorry. You have the wrong dad to try to sneak that past, because this is what I do. But abuse is not everything. Trauma is not everything. So we need to use those words carefully. But though we need to not shy away when there are patterns of insulting, berating behaviors, and call it what it is and say that's bullying behavior and that's emotionally abusive. It is. That's never acceptable. You have a question.
It's kind of related to kind of this slide. So you have like the spectrum, and you have unhealthy to abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at this example, it is very like on this like very obvious. Do you see a situation where it's just constant unhealthy that eventually becomes abusive, or is it always this egregious like my vision? Like,
yeah, it's not always obvious is the answer. And for the sake of the exercise, I gave you 4 categories, but we could say there's nuance even between those, right? There's unhelpful behavior or unhealthy behavior that is more or less harmful to people. There is unhealthy behavior that is harmful, but probably would still fall short of abusive patterns. And then there are, within abusive patterns, things that are less severe and more severe. So absolutely, more nuance. And the key is, because it's often a pattern of behaviors, one of the examples that we didn't note here, but it's on your handout, is a council board member who's treating his spouse in an emotionally abusive way behind closed doors. But who are the people who see that in the church community? Him and the spouse. But nobody at church, they're the nice Christian family, and nobody knows that that's going on. So it can be really difficult to see those patterns because it's intentional behavior. A lot of it is carefully hidden, not all. We've dealt with plenty of churches over the years where they're like, our pastor has done these things, and people have seen him doing these obvious, physically threatening, emotionally abusive patterns that are just clear. But there are times where there's nuance, and it's difficult. Yeah. Okay. This, 1 second, we need to take our break to keep on track. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our break, but here is the framework that I mentioned. So I'm gonna explain this in 2 minutes, and then we're gonna take our first break. This is the framework that we've created to help leaders thinking about how do we continue to foster that culture of safety that reflects the heart of Jesus. So for leaders, there are 4 key areas within our church. We have to help people understand Jesus cares deeply about children and vulnerable people, and certainly every person, right? Especially people who are more easily targeted for exploitation. All of us have to get that as a church community. The safest communities are where everyone understands that. Second, we have to raise the education level. So as leaders, we have to have those safety talks for the kids and talk about safe behaviors and boundaries and what to do. And with the leaders or the student leaders and the kids leaders, certainly, we need to have those conversations and have training and resources. But really with the whole community, we want to raise the level of education. Again, you have to do it wisely. We'll talk more about that. And then we have to have a few key boundaries or standards of conduct for everybody. You can't have 20 rules, that'll never work, but you can have 4 for everybody, broad things about our words, about how we interact with each other. If everybody has those 4 standards in mind, it just gives a bad faith actor much less room to try to push boundaries. So leaders, we need to think about a strategy for that, and we'll talk more about that. And then documenting so we can recognize a pattern of boundary pushing when that's happening. And then we need to cultivate and foster a culture of accountability. Every one of us should be accountable because we're Christian disciples. Disciples are accountable. That's what the word means. We're teachable, we're accountable, we're learning, we're growing. And leaders, we have to foster a culture where there's real, genuine paths for accountability for everybody. The most difficult people to hold accountable are other leaders typically, right? Because they have a lot of power. Okay, so we're gonna come back to this and we're gonna walk through this. Let's just take a 7-minute comfort break, because we have our lunch break coming up real soon. So see you at 11:25. So see you in 7 minutes. Do some self-care, walk around, stretch, deep breathing, get some water, step outside, and see you in a few minutes. All right, please come back. Come have a seat. Right, I'm inviting you back. I'm trying not to berate you at all. Okay, here we go. We have a lot to get to. So again, this is our framework that, again, I want you as leaders to take this forward from this day, to continue to take it forward, and that you can use. You could use this as again, if you're church staff, to talk through these areas. If you're in a particular area of ministry within that area, how are we making our people aware and working on these 4 critical areas? So let's talk first about this, connecting this to our Christian faith, to the heart of Jesus. We've already done a lot of work on this, right? We've already mentioned Jesus' teaching. So just a few more areas, though, I want to talk about. So everyone in the church should understand, because it is a prominent teaching in the Holy Scriptures, that God cares deeply about the vulnerable and the oppressed. So there are categories of vulnerable people throughout the Scriptures that are mentioned all the time. Children, orphans, widows, people with disabilities, the stranger, the immigrant in the land, right? People who, other categories, people in poverty, who are more easily targeted. They have less resources to defend themselves. And so those categories are mentioned literally hundreds of times by God in the Scriptures to call us to be careful and sensitive for how those types of people are more easily exploited. And that gives a window into the heart of God. So you get passages like Psalm 68, that this is who God is. His heart beats for orphans, for widows, and for the vulnerable, and calling us to give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Psalm 82. And we know the Psalms are given to shape our faith and our spirituality, right? That's the whole point of them. We've already talked about how Jesus vocally named and condemned abuse, the widows, the millstone passage about the children, which, by the way, let me just share this really quickly. In that context, talking about children, Jesus uses that language. You'll remember it. If your eye causes you to sin, do what? Gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, do what? Cut it off. Memorable language, obviously. What careful scholars of the Bible have pointed out is that almost always in the time of Jesus, that language referred specifically to sexuality. The eye of lust. That's what's being talked about. If your eye causes you to sin, it's the eye of lust. The hand that gropes, that assaults. That's what's being talked about. Jesus used that language earlier in Matthew's gospel in the Sermon on the Mount. Do you remember what he was talking about? Sexuality. So when he talks about children being exploited and the serious judgment that awaits those who harm children, and then he brings that language up again, is it a stretch or a strong contextual argument to think, what is Jesus primarily thinking about here? It's children who are in the Roman Empire. It was a big, widespread issue, just like it is today still, right? So, by the way, if you're an early church history fan, one of the earliest works that we have from the early church after the New Testament is a work written in Greek called the Didache. It just means teaching. And chapter 2, this is how Christians are to live and walk in our faith. The first thing is you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. But the third commandment is you shall not violate children. Where did that come from? Well, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. We know that comes from the Bible. The early church didn't make up a lot of stuff. They tried to really just ground everything that in what Jesus said and taught. And so it's, again, a strong argument that Matthew 18 and the children in the millstone passage, that's exactly how they understood it. Because they then said, number 3, we don't violate children. That's not how we walk as Christians. That's not our ethic. So leaders, we have to use the scriptures when it talks about widows to talk about abuses of power. When it talks about the orphans and the poor who are exploited, to talk about abuses of power in God's heart. I'll never forget one of the first trainings I ever did in a church. A woman took me aside in a break, and I would guess she was in her 80s. And she said, Mike, thank you for this training. And I had just been talking about God's heart for the vulnerable and the oppressed. And she said, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. And I have been in church all of my life, and I have never heard a pastor talk about it, ever. And she said, when you talked about God's heart for children and for the abused and for the oppressed, she said, my heart soared. Leaders, that's what we want for every survivor. And again, I gave you the statistics. You have survivors here. They need to hear those things. From you as leaders, they need to hear those messages. And so I've given you some ways the Bible speaks to this. Here's another one. On page 1 of the Bible, it says we are made in the image of God, all of us. And that means we are invested by God with inherent value, dignity, and worth. And that's an amazing theme throughout all of Scripture. And so those are, again, these are scriptural themes. These are not modern things, these are not modern teachings, these are ancient teachings of our faith. So leaders, we need to do a really good job with this. So the question then is, how do we communicate with our people? How do we teach our people? How do we form them spiritually? Are we integrating these themes into that? Do we, as we preach through the Bible, as we have a class on spirituality, as we serve, as we pray, are we using these themes to shape people to see God's heart and God's priority? That's the issue. So all of us have room to grow in that area. So we need to get it ourselves so we can do this well for everybody. Okay. There are plenty of other passages that we'll bring up as we go through this training, but let's move forward for now. Another way to think of this is connecting Jesus' heart on these issues to our church's mission. Now, every church has some way of talking about your mission, your values, your vision, things like that. Some churches put it on a statement and put it on your website, and some churches it's unsaid, or it's more we just talk about it, and that's fine. However you do that, it would be really important, in my view, to connect how you talk about your mission to these issues. So one way to do that I think is probably every church can do, because I've never had a church say, no, this passage, we don't do this one. We don't believe in evangelism or the Great Commission. We don't do that. No, I've never had a church say, Mike, not here. So in this passage, we have the command of Jesus, make disciples of all nations, baptize, and teach them all that I've commanded. What has Jesus commanded? Are we to exploit widows and children? Nope. Are we to be like wolves? Nope. Are we to be like doves? Yeah. And also wise like serpents. And we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. We're to think about how our actions impact other people. That's how we're to act. And we're never to use power to exploit. That's an easy way to connect these issues to our mission of discipleship and evangelism, which, again, I know every church cares about. And in the scriptures, we get this question: what does it mean to know God? That language is straight out of the Bible. So in passages like this, in the prophet Jeremiah, at the time of Jeremiah, there were leaders who were incredibly corrupt. So much so that the prophetic rebuke was heaping oppression upon oppression, deceit upon deceit. They refused to know God. Those leaders refused to know God. They used their power to exploit people, to oppress them. And they presented themselves as what? Amazing, godly, scriptural leaders. Scary stuff. In another passage, it's positively framed. A few generations before, there was, by and large, a godly king named Josiah. And he used his power to protect the poor and vulnerable people from injustice. And it says, is this not what it means to know God? To know me, to know God. So do you see that in the scriptures, the basics of how do we know if we are in relationship and knowing the one living true God? You can tell by how someone uses their power. Do they use it to exploit or to protect? To serve or to be served? Do you remember the sons of Eli in Samuel? This is before Israel had a king. They were the most powerful political and spiritual leaders in the whole country at the time. So there was no permanent temple, there was no king, but there was a tabernacle. And Eli was advanced in age, so his sons were in charge, Hophni and Phinehas. And they were corrupt. They stole the parts of the offering because they were greedy, that they were not supposed to take. And the families who sent their children and young people to serve at the tabernacle, to serve the Lord for a time, they exploited them sexually and preyed upon them sexually. We would call that today adult clergy sexual abuse. Some of it was probably also child abuse by our definitions. But notice how the scriptures speak of it. Bluntly, it says these were worthless men. God, tell us how you really think, what you really think. But noteworthy again, they did not know who? They did not know the Lord. They did not know the Lord. A disciple is not above the teacher, but every disciple who's fully qualified will be like the teacher. Who is our teacher? Jesus is our teacher. Jesus talked about children and widows. He talked about exploitation. He talked about it. We're called to be like him. We're called to know him. We're called to walk with him. Paul did this all the time, right? This is a standard framing of our faith from the scriptures. All right. One other way to think about this and help our people, again, because it's not just you understanding this, right? It's about you helping all of our people here understand these things. It's about how we think about power and how we use power. So look at your handout on page 5. In the middle, let's talk about this scenario. And this is about a really good pastor, okay? Not an abusive pastor. So I'm going to read this and think about the kinds of power that Pastor Mark holds, okay? And let's just name some of them. Mark is a respected pastor. He does not abuse his power. Pastor Mark graduated from a seminary with honors. He's beloved in his church for his sense of humor, kindness, and willingness to help. He gives skillful sermons that challenge and encourage the church. He is average height, but his personality and presence can fill up a room. He is not afraid to speak about his own humanity and share about his own faith struggles. Many in the church view him as an extension of their family. Mark's a good pastor. He's a good leader. What types of power can we say that Mark holds? Let's just name some categories. Positional, yes, and trust. And that's a good way to say there are more formal types of power, like positions, titles, education, credentials. And there are more informal types, right? Charisma, personality, relational trust, that you build over time. Do you see that Mark holds a lot of those types of power all at once, right? And that just gives him a lot of power in the lives of his people. Now, Mark uses that power in the way of Jesus. Wonderful. And yet, we could all imagine what it would be like if someone holding these types of powers used them selfishly or even abusively, right? So here is something I put in the slides for all of us as leaders to think about. And I recognize there's a diversity of leaders in this room. Safe leaders are aware of the power they hold. And safe leaders are committed to using their power only in the way of Jesus. So it's good to reflect upon what types of power do I hold? Do I have education? Do I have verbal skill? By the way, there's a book called Redeeming Power by a mentor of mine. Redeeming Power by Diane Langberg. She helped found Grace, and she's been working in this area in her own ministry for decades. Her book really formalizes a lot of these categories of power in a helpful way, so highly commended to you. But there are those more formal types and informal types. But healthy leaders, when we need to be aware of the power we hold, because we need to commit to use it intentionally in ways that help and serve and bless and protect, never harm. So it's a really healthy exercise for you to think and just do some self-inventory. What types of power do I hold? When I use my power in ways that are really good, what does that look like? If I started to use my power in a way that was a little more self-centered, a little more, not even abusively, just a little more self-centered, what could that look like? That's a really healthy thing to do. Self-awareness is really, really important. So I leave that reflection to you in the slides to come back to. Every organization, we should have very clear standards when there are formal types of power relationships. So in a church, boss, employee, pastor, evangelist, or whatever, the categories you guys use for leadership and congregants, we should have very clear expectations for those, right? That really matters. And Jesus spoke about power in some incredible ways. Do you remember when the disciples started to realize, oh, you are the Christ. You're the king. You're going to rule. The disciples were getting very excited about that because they knew if you're the king and we're your 12, we are going to also have power and be able to tell people what to do. They got really excited. And Jesus immediately saw that wrong-headedness and rebuked them. And he said, you are used to thinking about power in this way. When you have power, you can do what you want and serve yourself. And Jesus took that and he flipped it on its head, right? And he said, there is a different way of thinking about power. The way I think about power is I use power for others, always and only. And that's radical. That's a uniquely and radically view of power that is unique to us as Christians, because this is straight from Jesus. And so he said famously, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's always about how I'm using my power for others. Amen? It's beautiful. Which means we are not above our teacher. But everyone who is fully trained will be like our teacher. And this is how we are to use power also. And this is how we are to think about power. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The good shepherd steps in the way. Do you remember that passage in John 10? When the wolf comes, what does the good shepherd do? Steps in the way, says, nope, you're not getting anywhere near these vulnerable sheep. And it's not just a metaphor about protection. It's about actual protection. Because that language is from the prophets. It's from Ezekiel 34 and Jeremiah 23, where the leaders at the time were corrupt and were preying upon others, and they were so self-absorbed, they weren't protecting the flock. And God rebukes those shepherds and made this promise. I myself will come and shepherd the sheep. And it's fulfilled when Jesus, God incarnate, shows up and says, I am the good shepherd. And then that language becomes how Christ-like leaders are named. Because Peter in 1 Peter 5 says, he talks about the shepherds. Why? Because Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. And we're not above our teacher. Leaders are supposed to be like the good shepherd. We're not the good shepherd, but we're to be like him. Which means that's shorthand for what? Using power to protect and serve and bless. Never using power for ourselves. So proactive leaders, we are to be safe. The safest churches have safe leaders first. Because we have the most power, we can do the most damage. We're safe emotionally and spiritually. And of course, we don't cross sexual boundaries with the vulnerable. So you can't outsource using power and protecting others. You're it. You are given power by God to lead and steward this community. And so it matters that we are healthy, that we are using power in the way of Jesus. And one more. Remember when Jesus rose from the dead, he said, all authority, all power in heaven and on earth is given to me. Which means the power we hold, whose is it? It's not ours. Who is Lord? Who is King of heaven and earth, of all things? Jesus. That's our faith. That's our confession. So that means any power we hold in our relationships, in the church, in our homes, in our work, wherever, that power, as Christians we know, it belongs to Jesus. It is only to be used in the way of Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. That is a uniquely revolutionary framing of power that we have to help our people understand. And that's how we disciple people. That's how we have, that's a part of it. It must be. So we can present this, and I think it's a beautiful framework. It's compelling to me. And I think that's a compelling way to lead people. So we need to talk, we need to name and say, this is the way of Jesus. Using power to harm others, exploit others, serve ourselves, that is not the way of Jesus. That is never acceptable. And we have to implement pathways as leaders, and I know that's the last part of the framework, but all of these parts connect, right? This heart of Jesus connects to accountability. So this is the summary of this first part, the first fourth of that framework, that we must foster a culture that reflects the heart of Jesus for the vulnerable and use Jesus' use of power. That must be a priority. That's what we're called to. So this matters. And again, as leaders, we have to foster this within our community. It makes a huge difference. All right. Education is the next part of the framework. And quickly, it's important to say that when we go to educate people in our congregation, sometimes we're not starting from a place of neutrality. Sometimes there are attitudes of denial about abuse or myths that people have been taught about abuse that are not actually correct. So we need to know and understand that as leaders and work against that because we want to meet people where they are. You know, we don't want to judge them harshly, but we want to meet them where they are and help them come out of those attitudes. If a church is in these attitudes of denial, and what I mean by that is, well, that would just never happen here because we have the most wonderful church. And I agree with you. You have the most wonderful church. You're lovely. However, like my church or any other church, just because our church is wonderful, that does not mean there could not be a bad faith actor. And we know that because Jesus told us so, right? He warned us about someone who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. So those attitudes of it would never happen here, or it would never happen in my church, or my family, or my neighborhood. We have to work against those attitudes. And of course, those attitudes are understandable. It's not a pleasant thing to think about, but we have to deal with the reality and the truth, you know, that most often it is someone we know and trust. Because the response is, oh, well, he would never do. Well, almost always in the cases we deal with, it is someone that's what people would say about them. It's someone they know. It's someone they trust. That's how it works. So we have to work against those attitudes of denial, and we have to work against common myths, you know. And here are some examples, and of course, we can interact around these some. One is, some people say, well, false reports, we gotta make sure we're aware there are false reports of abuse. There are, and I've seen some. But statistically, all of us need to know they're actually fairly rare. It's in a whole range of studies. It's usually like 92 to 98 out of 100 are actually true, depending on which study. And even some of those studies that bring back 92 out of 100, some of those are not false in the actual sense of made up whole cloth out of nothing. Sometimes we can't substantiate what happened. And we can't actually, reasonably know what actually happened. So we need to be educated about these things as leaders. So this is an area where I would again say, as leaders, these are good conversations for you to come back to and say, what are some myths that may be impacting our community? And can we have a plan for training that's going to address some of these that would help our people? That kind of thing. And sometimes it's not attitudes of denial or myths. Sometimes it's just part of being a church. There's a default to trusting people at church. We know the Bible says don't gossip. And so we have to help people understand, if you see Pastor Tony taking Erica away from everybody else, it's not gossip to go to Pastor Brian or to Sean or somebody in leadership and say, hey, I saw this. That's not gossiping. That's speaking up for someone who's vulnerable. That's doing what's right. So thinking about that, again, self-reflection. Are there issues that I need to work through? Have I been taught that abuse, false allegations are common? You know, maybe you need to educate yourself and kind of wrestle through that. If we in our community, if we have significant denial, attitudes of denial and myths, it undermines the other areas. The teaching of Jesus that we've been talking about isn't as urgent. The boundaries and clarity about how we treat children aren't as urgent. That we work on a culture of accountability, it's not as urgent. It just works against everything, so it really matters. So we meet people in denial and myths and we bring them into education. And it takes work. It takes time, and you can't do it overnight. You'll overwhelm people. And I know I'm giving you 4 hours of training on these issues, and I'm a little bit overwhelming you probably today. I understand that. But there's no substitute for talking about this and having training and educating people, because it just brings it out in the open, and it raises the level of safety. So there's no substitute for that. And it's difficult because, as you know, you can't just train people one time. And in any church, you have turnover, and you have to think, how do we do this in a sustainable way? How do we implement this in a way where we're taking incremental steps forward? That really matters. You do have to talk to kids. So I brought some of my favorite books for doing that with elementary age kids. Leaders, you can put these books out and point parents to them and say, parents, these are wonderful books you can read with your kids. These are great conversations to have with your kids. And those who work in the kids ministry, we recommend you have a regular talk. And it's super simple because all you have to do is read books to kids, and they love it. And you don't have to be the expert. The experts wrote those books, and that's all you have to do. Keep your eye on the ball and just read the book. That's what I did with my kids. We had those conversations. My kids are big now, but we had those conversations. We talked about those things. It matters. It empowers them. It gives them clarity that, and it gives them clarity because if an offender tells them, if you tell, then, you're going to get in trouble. But if they've already been told by their parent, nope, you're not going to get in trouble. People who hurt other people sometimes say things like that, but they're lying. If you have that conversation, the kid is more likely to speak up. And I know people who have read these books to their kids, and their kids did speak up when there was a need. It does work. It does help in prevention. With teens, we don't read them kids' books, of course, but we have a guide for giving safety talks for kids and for students we're going to give to you, and you can take a simple approach. And it's just about having a first talk for 5 or 10 minutes with those students, and then getting in the habit of doing that every so often. And you just tell them simple things. Jesus cares so deeply that you are safe, that you're cared for, that you're protected. We care about that too. That's one of our very first goals for us in our church community. 2, here's how you should be treated. No one should be taking you away from everyone else. No one should be pushing physical touch or pushing boundaries in a way that you are not comfortable with. And if they are, you can speak up and we will help you. We will stop it. We will make sure. You're just giving them clarity about those basic things, and it matters. And you have to repeat it. And you do have to make sure when, especially you're doing trips or things where there's, more vulnerable situations like sleeping arrangements and changing and showering and things like that, you do have to be a little more careful and a little more specific about how things are done. And that really helps because it's a deterrent for the adults who might cross boundaries. It is also essential because it forms the kids in how they should be treating each other and their peers and younger kids. We see so many cases nowadays in churches where there is problematic sexual behavior from the kids toward other kids. And so we need to have these talks not just because we want to protect them from adults who might be pushing boundaries, but so they are told, you need to treat your peers and younger kids especially really, really well, and here's what that means. And that's not okay to be pushing these boundaries with other kids also. So that really, really matters. So we have resources on that. We're gonna be sharing with you guys as leaders that you can continue to make progress in these areas. Now for adults, what I tell churches is, what I would like is for you to alternate internal talks and trainings that can be really simple, just covering your policy in a few key areas. Grow in it, get better at it, get more confident, learn more, build it out. You can do that internally, and I want that because people need to hear your voice. So I train at a lot of churches, train congregations. It's great. They like my experience and hearing from, a former pastor, someone who pastored locally for years. That's helpful to people. But that's not as powerful as hearing from their own leaders say similar things about God's heart and the heart of Jesus and our commitment to this. That also matters. And what I recommend is you dovetail internal trainings with having some external experts. Many states have online trainings for reporting issues and those kinds of things that are free. You can invite someone from a local child advocacy center. You can invite a trauma expert, a trauma therapist to come and talk. You can reach out to a local sexual assault resource center, domestic violence resource center, see if they do education for communities. Have them come and speak. So you can layer different experts from this community to speak on these issues also. And I think that's really powerful. And yes, you do have to overcome some barriers. Organizationally, it's a commitment. You have to invest resources. You have to commit to repeating training. But anything worth doing, is going to take care and time and cost and investment. So organizationally, there are some barriers there. And then individually, leaders, you can tell your people, I know you don't maybe work with the students, but this is an issue that impacts everybody. It impacts our communities. And all of us are around kids, by the way, at church, even if we're not a formal volunteer, even if we're not staff. And by the way, not just kids, other people as well, vulnerable adults or anyone. This is about all of us, and this is about our faith, right? So we use that first part of the framework to say, this training matters, please come, make this a priority. All right, we are at lunchtime. So I think what our plan is we're going to just take about 30 minutes or so, if we can, to eat quickly, and come back up. And we're gonna we'll feel it out. It might be 12:35 or 12:40, but because we do want to get you out of here with some Saturday left. So, Andy, come on up. And
Mike's essentially right there. Well, it's 12:05 now, 12:35, be back here. Lunch is for everybody, whether you registered or not. It's down in the fellowship hall area. Enjoy yourself. Have some good conversations. Don't bring the food back up here when you're done. Leave it down there. And we'll see you back in a few minutes.